So basically what you're saying is you have some sort of DI built into this library then?
It's very, very basic. It's a dictionary with a few well-known types in it. People can add their own types in there, but we're not doing any kind of anything special at all. It's a dictionary lookup. There's no, you know, there's no constructor invocations. There's no conventions. There's no object graph construction. It's really just a place to stash some well-known objects that you might need inside of your invocations. And our intent is that those are really just mainly the ones that we provide. But enough people asked for dependency injection hooks that we said, okay, we'll let you put stuff in there as well. Now, even that might be unnecessary with set handler because we have this other type, which is a binder base of T, and that just lets you pass in additional parameters here that can be, or additional arguments that can satisfy those other parameters. So in that case, it's just a shim, but it's you can think of it as a way to inject dependencies, but it's not a dependency injection container or even a service provider in any real sense.
And do you have sort of open generics, or is it all just, fixed types?
Nothing of the sort.
So I mean, another way you can do this is just giving people a context, right? And then the context has a bunch of properties for whatever thing you may want to have, and then it's just an optional argument at the beginning, and then it's always, you either have that or you don't, but then it's always the fixed number of arguments that has to correspond to the thing you're passing in at the end. Like if you want to solve the problem that people forget the arguments or forget the, have the wrong types or whatever, right?
Yeah, we could. You just described the invocation context, so that would be one solution to it.
Yeah.
Do we require that the extra stuff be at the end, John, or can it be anywhere in the signature?
It can be in any order. I think the one, maybe this is a concern, maybe it's not. I think this was a deliberate point of decoupling the handler and allowing the handler not to have to depend upon system command line types.
So
I'm not sure. I think it's
so the handler just understands. It just looks for an I-value descriptor for each of the parameters, and in the ones that are listed, so you're basically putting an ordered list of the options and arguments that you expect, so that those are I-value descriptors that can be accessed when it goes through the parameter list to fill in arguments. And so if that's not a option or an argument or something that it could find in its list, then it finds it from its service provider or from some other mechanism if somebody has set one up. I think it's extension point. Put your own mechanism in there. But most of the time it goes through and says, hey, do we have this in the service provider? No. Well, let's look at the next thing in the list. Oh, we used that one, toss it out. And so when it comes to the next one, it says, is it service provider? Yep, we got it. And then we go to the next one. It says, is it service provider? No. Well, we're going to go to the second item because we threw the first one away, and just goes down through that list in an ordered manner. So that's kind of the mechanism of that binding. And don't tell me if I mucked that up too badly.
That's exactly. I was just looking for the code sample.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, that's kind of the thing that makes me slightly nervous in terms of complexity, because I think we already have a decent amount of these patterns elsewhere in the stack, and I think there's two ways of doing it. One is you're not doing it at all; it's just a higher layer concern. Another way of doing it is to basically integrate to the other things we have, like Microsoft dependency injection, for example, right, or some other stuff. But I think the thing in the middle where we kind of have it, but at a minimum fashion, may be more complexity than we may want. Or that makes sense.
So we deliberately discourage that kind of usage, right? And that's why you can't add things to it that are an open generic and expect anything to work. The main reason it exists, I think maybe showing a code sample of this might be more instructive. It's effectively, you're just passing the dependency into set handler in the slightly less than simple case. Yeah, John, you'll just pass a binder in there that gets you an HTTP client, say.
I don't think we put a sample in there if you want to find one. Email, what we're trying to say is we agree with you. Okay, so we don't want people using this for that. We want to be able to have an open set of things that we create, and we didn't block it completely in case somebody creates something that's a better iConsole. It's serving the same set of functionality, and they want to set something else with the same very limited set. As I said, we really don't want to play in dependency injection land here, because setting up is big container when none of it may be used, because you may be on a path where none of that's going to be used. So we really want this just to be a simple lookup for the things that we're using. And we could close it as an extensibility point. We left it open again for things like somebody has a different iConsole, or somebody has something similar to that where they're using the same basic, I need this to just operate this mechanism to stick in there. So I certainly do not want us to perceive this as a dependency injection by anybody, and I certainly don't want us to include a dependency injection framework, at least not at this point, with our current, and we don't have a way to do it in smarts.
I mean, it seems to me like the handler is like a fairly simple thing, right? So like, I'm not sure that we even need sort of like, arbitrary like signatures, right? I mean, you could even go so far and say, there's one way to register a handler. We give you an entire thing that you can, inspect, right? Which is effectively the invocation context, I think. And then that's the only thing you have. Everything else is you write your delegate and do whatever adaptability you want to have between your actual worker methods and the thing that takes these options and gives them to you, right?
Let me bring in a different. So the reason that this binder, and I put a link in there, we get this question about how to do dependency injection with system command line all the time, and we made a real conscious effort not to implement something for this, right, and just to say you can compose in your own solution. Now, the binder base, what this is doing, when you see the custom binder in the sample that I just posted a link to, it initially was introduced to solve a different problem, and it just happens to also solve this problem. The problem that it solves is you might have a CLI that has 50 options on it. We don't have set handler methods with 50 generic type parameters on. We already have more overloads there than we need, and we're going to reduce that. But say you have a complex type that you want to pass into your handler, and that complex type, you're going to build it from the values of maybe a dozen different options. What the binder does is it just lets you effectively declare some type that knows how to build you the T you care about out of the 15 different options or dozen different options that are needed to satisfy it. Right. So it's a way of getting arbitrarily large, complex CLI grammars to be bound into a very small number of types that you actually need to use at runtime. Right? But the interface is so simple that you could also use it to inject a logger, which is what that sample that I just pasted in there shows.
So what part of the sample am I looking at?
If you just scroll down to where it says
custom logger.
Yeah, if you just look, it's really that's the whole sample, the custom binder.
If you could put the next block fully on screen, that would be awesome. It's this one. Yeah, if you could just scroll down a tiny bit, get rid of the usings, and we'll have it all. Yeah, so that's the entire code. So you can see that on in the set handler, there's a file option and also a new custom binder. And the custom binder gives you a logger from the get bound value is what binder base needs you to override.
Used here.
In this case, I believe it does not. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I passing it down is not necessary in this sample.
So maybe I'm missing something essential here, but like I personally don't know why the translation from this option to this thing here, which is I guess just more or less dot value, needs to go via this level of interaction, right? Because basically the person that basically invokes the handler, they're standing on the option already, right? So that there's other things you want to pass into your methods, like an iLogger, for example. that to me is part of the actual app model that you end up using, right? But like this thing that what this command line library does is allows me to provide the options and then let it parse, right? So like I don't understand why this part here, I guess, that does, you know, the complex stuff to look up an iLogger needs to be part of the command line stuff at all. Like it seems to be almost like a completely separate problem.
I think you may, I may be wrong on this, but I think you may be coming up on one side of a question that we think about a lot. And you may be so much on one side of that question that you're not seeing that there are two sides, and maybe there shouldn't be two sides. So I think it's probably worth doing. So when we look at something like this and we're attaching to a method, should that be just a normal method? You never, it's just a normal method. There's absolutely nothing special in the thinking. And therefore, if it needs a logger, it expects to be able to take one. And so this is something that you wrote without considering that. On the other hand, there is I'm going to create a special shim for my method that's going to be for the CLI, and it's a special shim. And I make sure that things are named correctly. And if it's in an opinionated layer, there may be extra opinionated layer things on it. And therefore, I can find, in this shim method, I can go find my logger. There's no reason that I need to go through this complexity to pass it in. This is a balancing act that we've done from the beginning, and it's worth talking about, I think, if maybe. And as we've looked at that, it's been we want to enable it to be just any method. And if the method that you're trying to bind to needs a logger, we're going to give you a way, not a particularly elegant or pretty way, and certainly it would be easier to write a shim, so you can just use your normal method. And whether or not, if you all have an opinion whether we're right on that, that'd be fine. But our opinion so far has been we'll do a backflip to allow you to do a backflip too, in order to use your normal method and not force you to build a shim that could go and get that logger for you, which in this case is obviously an easier way to do it.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm concerned about this is that to me it is not a command line parsing concern, right? It's more like a how do you want to write your app kind of concern, right? And I understand that there is a gray area in between, right? But I think so if we zoom out for a second, right, and we just look at the larger picture here, which is also like the whole configuration subsystem that we have, right? Microsoft extensions like configuration, right, or the the general host builder model that we talk about, right? I think if we say, hey, if people, what's our way to write command line apps, right? Then I would say command line parsing is part of that, but so might be the other part of the whole hosting stuff. But I think if we
Absolutely.
if we take that, then maybe, and I would agree with you, right? If I write a hosting, host builder style app, then of course I would expect to have methods or constructors that take an iLogger and the DI system somehow magically news one up, right? But if I just use the command line library as a building block, then I think it might be better for us if we just keep that to this domain only, and then say if you want to do something more fancy on top of that, maybe it's part of this other thing that I just talked about, or you just write your own, right? But I think the more, I guess, the more glue we provide, the more sticky the library becomes in things that have nothing to do with command line parsing. And every time we've done it, we kind of regretted that. That's why I'm very hesitant to say I understand that it adds value here, but it seems like we are paying a fair bit of complexity to provide what I would consider a very minimal amount of syntactic.
So let's get back to that, and I'll let John answer that. You said one thing I really want to push back quickly on. You said if you want to do it differently, you can write your own. It is very, very much a detriment to us if we allow or encourage. We can allow. We're not going to block you may do anything, but we do not want people writing their own parsers, because the value of this is consistency across our ecosystem. If you're using an application, by default, the easy way to get there is everybody uses exactly the same features, and you can count on them being consistent. So tab completion will work if you do the right things, and eventually we'll make that easier for you. You can count on things. You get help through all the different mechanisms that help happens. These details, you're going to get POSIX right. POSIX is the way we're doing POSIX. We think it's right. We work very hard on that. All of that's for free. We do not want people writing their own parsers. Now, there are shims, sure. And we can absolutely step back to that. But I just wanted to clarify that our goal here is this across our ecosystem consistency, and that's just super important to keep an eye on.
So I think you may have mistaken what I meant.
Okay.
So like my point of writing your own wasn't about the parser. It was about the way. To me, this is why I'm very keen on saying let's have things like the parser be as focused on parsing and as little focused on anything else as possible, because it allows what you just said, right? So if I want to build a console app and I want to use, let's say, Ninject or some other attribute-based stuff, right? I should still be able to use the system command line for command line parsing, because as you said, that's the whole value prop that it provides, right? It does the heavy lifting of parsing and gives you all the other features like typo corrections that I think are very useful and are very isolated to parsing, right? But then the other things that we talked about, like, do you have a host builder? Do you take an iLogger, or do you take an iLog, or whatever the flavor of the day is? That one I would try to push away from this command line parsing as far as possible and say, the way you compose your command line apps, that is the flavor of the week, and I feel strongly that we should have a flavor. So I'm not trying to say like file new project just creates a console app and some assembly required. I think we should have one, and I think it would be better off if it would be like host builder based, similar to ASP.NET, right? But I think I would try to make this a layer on top and say let's keep command line as free of that as possible. And to me, the handlers are kind of in between, right? They're kind of halfway there.
I think you're describing exactly what we have. This sample is to show people how to wire this together as an example if they want to, because this question comes up constantly. People have asked for this from day one over and over and over again. We have a separate community provided library, which is system command line hosting,
right,
which does that composition that you're describing, but none of these concepts are baked into system command line. The other thing that I'd say about needing, a parser without the invocation semantics gets extremely complex. You're pushing something off onto people, which is they need to understand the parse tree and then figure out how to do the binding and invocation. If you don't do that for them, then you haven't really provided much of value. So that's what you're seeing here, is to provide that invocation. The analogy that we come up on a lot is for routing-based web applications, where you define a bunch of routes, right? And someone wants to have their method called, and that method is going, in a large complex code base, there might be dozens of different methods that are going to be called based on the parser input. People don't want to figure out how to do that routing. They do want to figure out how to get their method called, and they're always going to need things passed into that method by some means that didn't come directly from the parse tree. And so that's what this shim that you're seeing here is. The complexity of this is extremely low. It's only a few lines of code, and it's pretty open-ended, and it solves a bunch of problems that also relate directly to parsing that we don't have other solutions for beyond creating methods with an array of 50 parameters. So I think we agree with your concerns there, Emma, and what you're saying, that separation from how do I want to structure my app, how do I want to host my app, what dependency injection frameworks and logging frameworks do I want to use? We are completely unopinionated about those things, and it's very open-ended.
I mean, maybe the problem is that I'm not seeing the thing you just described, but to me, it seems like there is a fair bit of infrastructure to allow people to glue, whatever signature they have for their handler to whatever system command line expects. And I guess what I'm saying is
there's almost none.
I'm not seeing that is a thing that we need to provide, because I understand the routing concern where you say you have multiple commands and they form logically a tree. So the hard work is figuring out what is the best route that matches the command line that was given. I get that, but I mean the callback could be pretty uniform across them, right? You basically give them the command that whatever representation you want to denote for the particular route, and then the things that are specified. It doesn't have to be a complicated thing that says, oh, you give us a delegate signature and we figure out how to bind to that. That to me is already a higher level concern. It has nothing to do with command line part.
Every command line parser provides that.
Well,
if you don't provide that, then you go down the path of what Jan had to do, right? Which is fine if you want that level of granularity and control, but it's actually a lot of boilerplate code, and we've gotten a consistent pushback on it when we didn't provide it.
I guess maybe I'm not seeing what that would be, because to me it's like in your handler you basically just access the captured of the file option. You can just have file option.value presumably.
You can do, and that's effectively what set handler is doing. But set handler it's a very small amount of code, and it's a lot more concise than what people would have to do otherwise. And we anticipate that we would probably source generate that eventually, but the it's just a lot of boilerplate effectively. And you can do it. You can do it today. You can say set handler and just pass in an empty delegate and do whatever you want inside of there.
So let's back up just a second. And there's like 3 distinct situations. There may be more, but I want to pull it down to 3. One is that we have a normal, just a native type, we have a string or we have an integer, something like that, and we're defining it. And we validate that. We take that all the way through and we give it to you as an integer that's strongly typed in the signature of your method. We believe there's huge value in that. We can get email. I want your opinion after I say all of this. I believe there's huge value in giving you an integer instead of giving you a result, and then you get something off of that result, but it's not, you have to type it now to integer, you don't get it as an integer, and it's just more stuff you have to do. So then there's that. And then there's this middle ground. There's actually 4. There's a middle ground, which is that we're creating a complex type, or you are. And so we have a custom binder, or we're doing something that's effectively a custom binder that takes a string and makes a file info. And so we believe this has huge value to people because they can just say file info, and then the signature of their message is file info, and they just get it. They don't have any more work to do. Now we have another area, which I'm extremely willing to lock down completely, which is we also have a lookup into our service provider, our dictionary. And I think that you're bringing in some really good points, and maybe we should just lock that down. It's ours, don't touch it. Okay. And then we have a final one, which is custom binder is actually how we handle an infinite set of options and arguments. And it's very important technically for that reason, because no matter how many T's we do, someone needs one more T in the arity of our generics. So we have up to like 16, T1, T2, 3, all the way up to like 16. And then if you want more than that, you use a custom binder. It's not that difficult to do, but it gives us a route. So technically, we have this other need for this particular infrastructure. We didn't write it just for this. We don't throw it away if we stop using it for this. So my suggestion based on your feedback, Emo, is that if you are primarily concerned about anything that looks vaguely like dependency injection, anything that says that's a service provider, we take our service provider and we lock it down. What we do with this document, I don't know. We need to talk more about that. The fact that people ask us all the time for dependency injection. They don't actually want dependency injection. They just want to get their freaking logger. And so that's why we have this article. It's slowed down a lot of conversations in our repo, and that's how we got here, is that this is what users wanted. Well, so that, anyway, maybe that's some context for this conversation.
So to be very clear, like I think I have no issues with the user ask, right? Because I think it makes sense to say I want to build a console app that has dependency capabilities, right? That's a completely reasonable thing to do.
Yeah.
I guess all I'm trying to say is that if you think of system command line as a fundamental building block for parsing command lines, then I don't think we should conflate that with things that I don't know, like there's certain words, like, for example, model binder or dependency injection, or, some sort of like a polymorphic adaptation between, you give us a delegate and we somehow bind to that to me, they are all like useful things. I'm not saying they're not useful. I'm not saying that they're not adding value. I'm just thinking that these are the things that historically we know we have changed a lot because the technology that we use to build those things has evolved a lot. Or opinion on what we think is, concise, sexy, or, I guess usable, or, lines of the expectation people have has changed over the years. But to me, the key part of parsing a command line argument and what you just said, right? I want to get an integer. I want somebody else to parse the thing. I want somebody else to validate that thing. Those are invariants of the domain, right? You take a command line and you give me the thing that represents that thing, right? But to me, that doesn't involve necessarily like, the flavor of the week and all we dispatch to the user code, right? That to me kind of could be a very separate thing, right? And I'm not saying I know exactly what you have here and whether that's that or not. I'm just saying when I hear things like, oh, we bind to this delegate signature, that seems to me one of those things that, for example, ASP.NET does with, controllers and routes, right? And they have changed that a lot too, right? They basically said, oh, controllers are too heavyweight. Now let's do minimal APIs, right? So like I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that might be something that we should have, but that might change. So we shouldn't put it in the same bucket as the core parsing, right?
So I have a clarifying question, and I'll save any opinions till Chet and John say something. So are you suggesting that we remove the set command handler binding altogether because you just talked about routes, or are you suggesting that we because that really causes a problem for the user, or are you suggesting simply that hooking up the arguments is problematic? And I would point out that I think ASP.NET still uses the same infrastructure underneath, and that's what we're building. Where the minimal CLI app is on the drawing board. That goes on top of all of this, and this will support it very well. So I'm just trying to understand exactly where we draw the line, because otherwise we're gonna discuss the wrong level here. So where exactly do you want to say this makes sense to me as part of this parsing library, and this concerns me? Because one of the other things we got out of the last one is that this needed to be usable out the door, and this is what we think is minimal usability, and that certainly is a question we can talk about, but it is where we landed on the work that we have right now.
So I can't quite tell you what I have in mind because I haven't used the library, so it's a bit hard for me to imagine what I think would be acceptable as a minimum thing. But my mental model looks a bit like this, right? You have a command here. The command has a bunch of options, potentially has subcommands. And my understanding is each of those commands has ultimately a handler that is invoked when we think that's the best route to the fetching the command line that was parsed. So what I would suggest is like trying to find a way to make that handler uniform. Basically say like the handler gets one input, which is, let's say, the context, the command that it was invoked for, right? And then, you know, whatever options you have, well, the handler presumably knows, right? Because either I have them as my delegate syntax, which is what you have on screen, but I think it's very reasonable to say, you know, in the handler, just say file option dot value, because you know that's the file option value that you wanted, right? And then if there's anything else that you want, right, your logger or whatever, well, you fetch that from some other place that is specific to the way you wrote the app. Maybe it's a global variable, maybe it's a DI-based thing that is invoked from your stuff, right? That seems all reasonable, right? But I think that to me is kind of the, like, I'm not sure it's the job of the command line parser to provide effectively an app model that has capabilities like injecting values, like the iLogger, for example, right? Or binding to whatever, you know, conventions you want to use in your app to define your handlers. The only thing you really have to do is tell people, like, given the command line you gave me and given the command specification you gave me, this is the command that the user meant to invoke, and here are the parsed representations of the values. And that to me is it. That will be the minimum thing. Or there might still be, like, you know, 10 lines of code because you have to fetch the values out, but that to me is, you know, makes sense. I mean, that's just the, you you invoke the command, I have to know what, you know, file to delete, let's say, right? And I want to say, oh, should I use force or should I just tell you what to do, right? Or what I would have been done, right? That to me is not necessarily something that has to be a parameter to the method. It totally be, in my opinion, it's acceptable to say, you say file option dot value and you say, you know, force option dot value, and then that's the way you process that. And if you want to dispatch that to a method, well, then you write the 2 lines of code that you know, invokes the method. It's not clear to me that you need this binding thing in the middle, basically. That makes sense.
Okay, I'm gonna let Chet and John respond before I respond to that.
And by the way, like, everything I'm saying here is informed based on 90 minutes of thinking about this, right? So like, it's a,
yeah.
If I'm uninformed,
I'm worried
that's very, very likely.
I feel like the success we've had so far, and Tanner's still here, so he's actually used this. Just for clarity, yawns only has a single command, and it's as you get into subcommands and complex CLIs that these questions get to be a bigger deal. But Chet, did you deliberately take your hand down, or is that just because you thought you were talking? As soon as you unmute. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so there's set handler is something we baked in, as Kathleen mentioned, to address a usability concern. Like, the thing needs to be usable out of the box, and it was a lot of, like, and it is a lot of manual code. You can do exactly what you're suggesting, Emo, right now. You can accept a parse result as the only parameter of your delegate, and then do those parse result.get value for options for your other options. So in fact, this is what we do in the .NET CLI. Part of that is driven because we are continuously aligning the code base more with how system command line wants to be used, and we're not done with that process. But part of it is also just because it's a nice escape hatch if you need it. Separately from that, the entire set handler thing can be plugged, and like that is the extension point for any number of other binding strategies, if you want to call them that, to come into play. Just because it is kind of gross. From some of the descriptions of what you were sort of describing as the ideal case, I got the impression that you think the option or the argument should collect the value in some way during parsing. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not saying it should. I assumed it did.
It does not. So that's a key concept to get across, is that the commands and the options and the arguments never actually contain the values of the parsed things. They're a description, and when you do that invoke async call, or when you do parser.parse args.invoke async, there's a separate sort of parallel set of structures called command result, called symbol result, etc., that have the actual value and a mapping back to the option or argument that they were parsed because of. Right. So if the options or arguments did have a sort of hole for the value to go into post parsing, then you could you definitely could just say file info.value there, right? But that's not the way the system has been architected, and John can probably talk more about the reasoning behind all that. So I'll delegate off to him.
But presumably you could say context dot get value, and then you pass in the file option. That would work.
Yes.
Yes, and that's what Jan was doing, and that's what we do in the CLI for the vast majority of our command handlers.
But is there any sort of I don't have to do any parsing, right? I get back at whatever the option of T is, I get back the T, right? Like that's...
Yep. It's all strongly typed all the way through, yeah.
And you're saying that is ugly, or messy, or whatever your description was.
It's boilerplate. That's it.
You see, that might be where I'm different. Like, to me, this seems fine. I mean, I would say it's not, because to me, this is kind of blending the space between, what I would consider syntactic sugar and what you consider a thing to do, right? So I think what you're describing as the desired outcome, I agree with, but I think that is where I think fashion kicks in, right?
I would flip this around a little bit, though. I think I agree with you, Emil. Like those layers make sense, right? The binding layer is a layer that sits on top of the parsing layer, but I would argue that, and we've seen this, right? And Dragonfruit is a great example of this. People don't actually want the parser; they want the inputs to their method, right? And the simplest, leanest thing you can do is just let them declare a method and invoke it for them. Now, Dragonfruit has a bunch of limitations, but it's been enormously popular. And over, we hear this is the simplest command line definition API people have ever seen. And the reason for that is you never see the parser. The parser is implicitly created and invoked for you, and you just get the values at the end. Now, and that sits on top of the APIs we're looking at today. And it is one of these, what you call kind of flavor of the day, right? We want to be able to create a lot of different versions of it. People are investigating binding doc-opt on top of this, which is another, really very different and popular CLI definition API. You should be able to take any API you want and put it on top of this. And I think the analogy to ASP.NET is a really good one, right? Those conventions change over time. And as language capabilities improve, like the natural type delegates and minimal APIs, we see better and better and more concise APIs that can sit on top of the core infrastructure. What we didn't want to do, we wanted to create that core infrastructure. What we didn't want to do is go out the door without at least a simple way for people to use it, without having to write all the boilerplate, because people really do want to focus on the method invocation and not on the parser mechanics, right? And so going back to this verbosity thing, right? Some of that verbosity is that people have to declare the parser and configure the parser separately before they get over to the handler. But the handler is where the meat of what they care about is going to happen. And that's, right. I'd say that's the case for the majority of our customers.
I mean, this goes back to maybe I just need to play with the library, but like, I mean, just looking at the code on the screen, I don't think it's what I would consider simple, because it's like you still have to do a decent amount of wiring that goes to a decent amount of interaction, where unless I'm an expert or, you know, I have used it before, isn't necessarily obvious either, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, to me, if there is boilerplate, but the boilerplate is obvious, the end result might be less complicated than less code, but with more interaction or abstractions.
This on the screen right now is a 0.01 case. This was to answer a question, and we do not make dependency injection easy. This is not the right route for it, and for all the reasons we just talked about, this is not normal code. The simple example with more options, more arguments, and more subcommands, that is the 90 to 95% case. That is by far the most common case. All this complicated stuff that we're winding up into is just that. It's complicated.
Yeah, I do think we're over-indexing a bit on complexity. Set handler is a whole bunch of overloads that just save you some boilerplate for a very straightforward thing.
We could pull it into a different package, and we could make set handler one of the many opinions that we work on in the bottom layer. Like from the point of view of our documents, of our docs, I'm not sure I change it. I think I'd suggest people get both packages, just because to do this, I mean, we'd show how to do it without the set handler, but it just is, people wind up writing their own iCommand handlers, which is a possibility.
It is, and it's effectively, that's all that set handler is doing, is creating an iCommand handler for you. But the code inside of it is boilerplate. It would be better generated probably, but if we go out the door without having an easy way to define a handler, hopefully even easier than set handler, then I think that we've provided a library that is not usable by itself.
See, like, I mean, I'm not doubting anything you're saying. I just have a hard time seeing the problem the way you describe it. To me, it seems like, if I just look at this code here, right? So I think, like, if we ignore the dependency injection portion, right, then my understanding is that the iLogger disappears, this my custom binder disappears, and then this type here disappears, but the rest is still representative of what you think the flow is. Is that fair? So then, to me, it would be acceptable to say, like, in this handler thing, you take into context and you say, file option value is, var file option value context dot get value for a file option. And then you say, why do you do this kind of extraction and forwarding? Seems, in my opinion, fairly okay, because, I mean, again, I have to pass this thing in here. I have to align this thing here with the thing I pass in here. So there is, already some amount of complexity, but now it's just like, well, I give you the context, you extract the values, and you call any method you want with whatever subset of values you want in any order you want.
I think we're agreeing on pretty much all points here. Honestly, I think we've been going around in circles, but I think we agree. This sample is not showing you the complexity of system command line. It's showing you how to compose in something we don't do for you, because it's such a common custom.
And we deliberately do not make easy.
Yeah, I guess what I was just trying to do is
not how we want you to get a logger.
Yeah, what I was trying to do is, like, if we ignore the iLogger portion and we just look at the core part of it, then I think to say, like, you just have to extract them values and call your own, method seems, in my opinion, fairly reasonable. But again, I've also written 0 command line apps with that, so I don't know why.
That gets really complicated as soon as you have multiple commands. As soon as you have multiple commands, now people have to look at the parse result and decide which of their different methods to call based on. Right, so you're seeing kind of the routing piece there. I think that if routing is indirection, I'd say it's actually a fairly critical piece of indirection to build maintainable apps.
Well, I would still expect when I have subcommands that I would have multiple handlers, right? And you are deciding which one to call, but in each of them,
exactly,
I just get the context representing this particular thing, and I just extract the particular things for this one thing. I don't have to do this myself, right? So I'm not saying you should have one global handler and then people just have to switch over that. I'm saying, instead of giving you the bound, I guess, method thingy, you just give them the context for the thing that they have, and then they extract the thing for this particular part of the parse tree. But yeah, that to me is still the thing that the library does, right? Deciding which one matches the best given the input. So, but again, like I may have to play with it to actually see the problem you're describing.
So I'm going to suggest that we put Tanner and Kevin on the hot seat for just a minute. Kevin Bose, by the way, is with us. He has a MVP and a key contributor to System Command Line, and they have both used it. And so if they could comment on the value set handler, did you use it? Did you not use it? Was it super important? Was it not super important? Did you only use dragon fruit? Just, I think that'd be super valuable right now, just to hear other than us that have been thinking about this for quite deeply. Kevin obviously has also been thinking about it quite deeply. But Tanner, I'm putting you on the hot seat.
Yeah, so I don't use dragon fruit. The stuff I use in Clang Sharp is mostly just the direct root command support and stuff, and I've notably not updated to the very latest version. I'm still, I think, from whatever version was at the beginning of the year. So I'm not using the value set handler either. It looks like the code I'm using is here. But it's mostly just it's slightly more complicated because I'm taking a bunch of options, some of which are specific to my own handler, and some of which are pass-through options down to playing itself. And so it's doing a lot of getting the parse result and then pulling out the options and then doing some of my own manual validation, which was something that didn't exist at the time I had initially written this, but which I believe does exist in the latest version, and I haven't finished working on that branch yet to make it functioning.
Yeah, I mean, so you've done the Yan approach of manual binding. Yeah, and so Emo, this is what you're seeing here with this invocation context. This is like the most wide open version of a delegate that you can have, because the invocation context has things like cancellation token on it, has direct access to the help builder, has the parse result as you're seeing there. You can even directly set the exit code instead of letting a piece at the middle where set it yourself if you want, right? So this is I truly want to be minimal and have zero magic.
Yeah, this
just
one
give me this thing and I'll hook it up.
Would be in the realm of ugly, right? But what I would expect to be able to do is like value for option. I pass in my instance of the option, which is already
which you can in the new API.
Yeah, so I wouldn't have to specify this. I wouldn't have to specify this. But then I think the end result of that I would consider very usable.
So, John, if you pass the actual option or argument, do you get the correct type back automatically, or do you have to type it the way you do with the old name-based?
No, you get the correct. It's
okay.
Generically.
So this name-based thing we removed. So
yeah, this name-based. This was one of the things that caused problems for trimming, and so this was moved out into a separate library. So this can be, if you've built code that's using these name-based APIs, there's a separate package you can pull in, which is System Command Line Naming Convention Binder, and this code will still work once you just add that namespace in.
And in my case, I plan on taking all of this and porting it to the new built-in stuff rather than keeping the current name-based syntax, because I believe some of the new APIs were taken based on my feedback of this was very complicated for me to maintain. It's just a lot of work to do the transition from what I've got today to the new stuff, and so that's why it's not quite in the new shape yet.
So, Tanner, can you articulate a reason that you chose this approach over set handler? That would help me.
Set handler didn't exist.
Yeah,
it didn't exist at the time.
Okay, that approach to set handler didn't exist. We were on the old name based. Okay, great. Okay, but do you think you would use set handler now?
Yeah, the plan is to migrate to the new stuff rather than doing this name-based approach. It's just a lot of work for me to do, and I've been busy with generic math, so
it's fine. There's two new approaches, and I'm just trying to clarify
okay.
which one you think. So there's the new approach of the set handler, which is there since you started this, and also you could do value for option and then pass in the option or argument if you had tracked it through the way Jan did via the public properties that he used. You would have to track that through to your method, so you would be forced to make it a field or a property. But would you be more likely to still use the context and then find a way to still have access to your options so that you could get that value, or would you just use the parameters on the method and the set handler and have that automatic?
I'd prefer it to be automatic. And I believe you support not just passing it in through a single parameter, but through a struct as well. And so that'd be the approach I would do rather than individual parameters, because there's a lot of them.
What to say? I don't want to go to method with like 30 arguments.
There's no reflection.
Yeah. Do we still
the binder that we were describing before is exactly the solution to what Tanner was just saying. Right? Is you want a single parameter that's coming from, say, a dozen different options or arguments, and so you want to effectively tuple them somehow. That's the equivalent to the kind of struct-based binding, which was very reflection heavy, that got moved out into the naming convention binder package.
Yeah. So we just have a couple more minutes, and I'd kind of like to figure out how we're going to close on this, because it's pretty significant. So we're basically defining the edge. This is the way I'm visualizing it right now. We're defining the edge of where the parser is and where things built on the parser start. And specifically, we have the set handler approach, which we identify something we're talking about. We have the set handler approach on the parser side in the current structure. And the question, as I see it, is how do we kind of get more than Emo's opinion on the table? Because Tanner just said he wanted it simpler, except that he's got so many arguments, maybe it wouldn't be simpler anyway. How do we get that question sort of resolved? Because it is just a matter, to my mind, John can disagree, of how we structure our packages. I mean, this is the binder is already a separate namespace, so we don't have any deep fundamental things. It's just how we package and what we consider our core and what we consider built on top of our core, and whether set handler is just the most primitive opinion and it goes along with all the other opinions, which will not likely use set handler anyway. So it will not be needed for things like the little prototype I put, just to give people an idea of how simple this should be. It should be super simple in that. Ideas, Emo, on, I mean, do you want to play with it? Do you have time to play with it?
I mean, I'm planning on playing with it because I have a bunch of command line tools that, you know, use different kind of ways of doing things. I usually use mono options. So I want to play with it, but I think it would be good to have other people's opinion, because I mean, I'm clearly biased towards something a bit more simple.
Again, we need to be super clear that the point, and look, I'm not saying anything is against mono options. We are different than mono options. So we have, and we looked at mono options. We looked at Nate's stuff. Nate was part of this project beginning. It's also an offshoot of these years and years and years of evolving parsers inside Microsoft. This is the next generation of the old CLI parser, which came from a bunch of other history. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought in that. But on mono options, at least when we looked at it, it was not strongly typed, and it was going to be difficult without breaking changes to get it to POSIX compatibility. So those were two of the things I remember from where it was. It does take the approach of giving you a result, and then you look it up in a non-strongly typed way, and you get a string back, and then you work with your string. And the validation is relatively limited because of all of that. So this is the reasons that we didn't just expand. We looked at all the libraries out there. And there's various reasons for different libraries is why we didn't just build on one that was already there. Because my goal was making .NET Tools work. If we hadn't had this for .NET Tools, I don't believe .NET Tools would have been as successful as they have been.
To be very clear, I'm not defending mono options. All I'm saying is that that's what I'm currently using, but my
right. So this will be more complicated because it's doing more. Right. And then our expectation is there will be simplifying layers that sit on top of this. We have one included, which is set handler. And so, that is what it is a simplifying layer, because then you can just write your function unless it has a boatload of arguments.
And I would say, this is more complex for the simple case, but it is massively simpler for real world applications and complex scenarios. And I think that is more important. I don't care if I can write, hello world type console apps in 3 lines of code. That's useful for showing off something, but I'm never going to use that in practice or production. If I've got something that simple, then I could just, int.parse my arg and do no validation or anything else. Yeah, but when I'm writing an actual shipping command line tool where I need to support many options over time, I need to support Unix and Linux and Windows and everything else, that the current setup and approach they've got massively simplifies everything and makes it easy to understand, to control diversion over time and everything else.
I think we need to be more specific when we use phrases clearly. Like, so when I meant simple, I meant less complexity. So to me, this includes like not having a binder built in. What I said initially about mono options was about being concise. These are like completely different things, right? That's why I asked for the selection initializer syntax, right? And so I'm not pushing for more concise. That one I think is also within, it would be nice to have, but it's not critical in my opinion. But simplicity, as in like, we don't have to have a lot of types or API surface that deals with, adaptation from your arbitrary, function signatures to what you want to pass into handler. That to me is in the realm of complexity of the library, complexity of the API, complexity of us being able to evolve it, that sort of stuff. And I have coming from the BCL, I have a bias towards, fewer moving pieces, even if that means somebody has to write more lines of code on top. But in our experience, that results in things being more stable, last for longer time. And I think command line parsing is clearly important, and there's clearly something we have never done. And it very often was the reason because we couldn't agree on what the simple thing would be, right? So, but I do think what you have right now in terms of feature set, that you can support subcommands, that you can identify the best possible route, that you support POSIX, all of this is great. Like the only thing where I guess I get nervous is if we put in stuff that is more or less about making it just more concise for the user. You don't want people to write what that to me is not necessarily a red flag, as in like, oh, we cannot possibly ship this. It's just one of those things that I know from reviewing other APIs, that this is usually the part where we get in trouble. That's usually the part where we, in V1, massively underestimate the long-term support cost of these.
Well, I have a couple of comments on that. One is, I do agree that set handler is not quite ready, right? And it does feel like it should be layered out in some way, but we have to have something that accomplishes that goal in the box, or else we have, I think, delivered something that's not fully useful. The other thing I'd say is this library has been around for a while now. We've been in a very, very, very long beta, and we understand where the stability is and where it's not stable. And I mean, it's actually quite mature. In that sense, a lot more effort has gone into it over time than some things that, that don't have a beta tag on. And so I think we understand the maintainability of this library at this stage pretty well. And I'd love to get Adam's, responses to that too. We did a bunch of major refactoring on this with some deliberate breaking changes to improve the performance profile of it. And the ability to do that was something that was really based on the structure of the code, the tests that we have. There were very large changes that we actually were able to do pretty quickly. And so I think some of that speaks to there's a greater level of maturity to this library than your average beta at this stage.
To be clear, like my comments have nothing to do with quality or stability, right? It's just right. About when we Because I mean, one of the goals we have is to effectively have a command line parser that we can give people with almost file new project, right? And I think that, or if not file new project, that's why I'm very keen on let's create, you know, the thing as small as possible, because the smaller the API surface, the higher our chance of evolving it is. And I mean, the problem with beta periods is, as you said, like you have the luxury of making changes, right? And so that you know, that ship will sail, right, as soon as we ship it with the product. I mean, we can still make breaking changes, but it's just much harder if we say, oh, this was in file new project for every single console app, right? Which I think is the goal we have. And so I think we need to be, you know, I guess I would rather live in a world where we ship a V1 where it's a bit more boilerplate than we wish, and then we can improve over time, than shipping something now that results in less boilerplate, but in a release from now we're like, oh shit, why did we do this to ourselves? And all I'm saying is that because I don't have the, you know, the glass to look in the future, all I can do is look in the past. And the pattern that I see when we ship APIs that we had this reaction to was for things like what I see the binder is doing, right? I'm not saying the design you have is bad. I'm not saying this is guaranteed to happen. I'm just saying that seems like something that, you know, might be more complex than we think we have, right? And that's the only reaction that I have to that, right? So it's a gut feel. I will completely admit that. So it's not something that, you know, I would say, oh, we cannot ship this API because you didn't address this concern of mine. But I just wanted to raise it and say, just, you know, poke a little at it and say, like, you know, how required is this really, right? Or something we could factor out.
So let me ask a question, Ema. Would you be comfortable if we pull binding into a different package and move towards GAing only the non-binding portion, the underlying portion, but kept the set handler binding layer as it is today, with the same name to avoid breaking people, as we're just trying to take a pause on it? And then we left that in beta. We did not go GA with the binding. We only went GA with the underlying tools. Would you be comfortable with that?
Certainly more. I mean, again, like my experience as a library is 90 minutes at this point.
Yeah, and we haven't touched on the core. So exactly. If we were to back off of this, we haven't even looked at the public surface area of the API with binding removed. And so I think it's something that we can talk about. But Tanner has his hand up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I definitely agree with Imo in that we've historically had issues here, but at the same time, I think that there is a lot of cumulative experience for command line parsing, processing, and what's required here in real world apps. And I think that this is fairly representative of what's actually required. And I'm not sure I want to say this should be the goal for every .NET New console app. I think instead we should say the goal is this is what people go to for any .NET tool that you install, or you know, not just toy programs, but things that people are actually trying to ship. Because those are kind of two different experiences and two different goals. And while I think simplifying the toy program thing is cool, it's not ultimately helpful to the ecosystem. I think it's fine if we have a few more lines of code and we push people towards source generators and stuff for removing the need to write the boilerplate, just like we've done with the JSON APIs and many of the other APIs where we know we have this complex problem that needs to be solved, and we want to solve that and then look at simplifying it for users to consume later.
Yeah, so to me, I mean, what you said, I agree with. Like, I don't have a goal to have, you know, a 4-line hello world with that I don't care for. I mean, it would be nice, but to me that is kind of orthogonal. It's just the primary goal I have is I want to say .NET has a command line parser that we think is good, right? That you know, given that we are like 20 years into the platform, seems like a fairly reasonable and long overdue situation to be in. So yeah, I don't know, like next step for me would be to play with the library, but I think we should probably also like schedule another review maybe in, I don't know, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. I need some time in between in order to work on the backlog, because we've had a lot of long meetings now. So I can't put you on the slot immediately again, but it also seems like, you know, at least I need some time to play with it anyways to actually have more of an informed opinion, I guess. But
we're here to help, and there's docs. Yeah.
Yeah, and there certainly is other things in here that we should talk about. I mean, I see that you have an abstraction over console as well to actually, you know, pass it around, I guess. So these are all things we should talk about, I guess, that we didn't have time for today.
Yes,
anything else?
We identified several. At the top of this issue, there's several things identified. I think we had 4 or 5 that we called out, set handler being one of them. So we've gotten deeper on that one. And yeah, I think the general ergonomics was one of them, but I think that set handler is really the core of that right now. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the rest of I mean, it seems like the only people that really talked today was, you know, me and Tanner for the most part from our side. It would be good if there's other people on our side actually playing the library more or stay with their opinion of the library is, right? But we should have at least.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that too is that like you are the ones that actually have experience with using libraries like this. The rest of us are just kind of looking at it from a shape perspective.
If someone wants to play with the library by fixing up ClangSharp to use the new conventions,
it's sweet that you think we will have time.
Well, thanks everybody for your attention to this and your input. And John made a comment in the chat about how he's thinking about maybe how to look at set handler. I want to look at some samples without set handler. What would that actually look like? It could be we have an underlying abstraction for the for iCommand handler, and it may be asking people to implement that. In which case, we need to talk about that. Right now, it's a minor thing with a single item, so it's an interface. Maybe it should be a base class. We can talk about that next time.
Yeah, so that's something we should do. We should go over the entire API service and have that conversation. Because today we focused more on the big blocks, I guess, compared to last time. But we should definitely, you know, walk the API service like we always do for libraries before we ship them. And have a conversation about naming and, you know, interface versus class versus kind of thing.
Yes.
So 3 weeks from now, okay? Or
yeah, there's some possibility I won't be able to make it because I have some upcoming vacation. John has some upcoming vacation, so we'll let you know. John's critical. I'm desirable. I mean, it's better if I'm there, but it's Chet and John can handle it if I'm not. But we do need John, so he can send you his vacation.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Calendar isn't open.
All right. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
And then hopefully nobody's angry at me.
I'll buy you a beer soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.